Thank you so much, Paige, for the intro, and everybody for coordinating and setting this up. And of course, all of you for being here today. How are we all feeling? Good? Okay, great. Um, this is such a pleasure for me. I really appreciate everyone who's here in person and virtually to listen in on this lecture that's specifically focused on the great artist María Magdalena Campos-Pons. Since she spent 30 years in Boston, anyone know the great Magda or came across her in your years here? Excellent, wonderful, so glad to hear it. So as you know, and as everyone else will come to know, a PowerPoint can never contain the beauty and majesty and energy of this great artist. The good news is that on November 13th, she's going to be here at the MFA, giving our distinguished Hale Lecture for Contemporary Art, so you can hear it from the artist herself. But yeah, as Paige said, I'm new to the museum, but not new to Magda's work. I had the privilege of curating her 4-venue traveling survey, Behold. So I've been researching her work since about 2018. And this time last year when I got to the MFA, it was just electrifying to know that the MFA had made a very important recent acquisition of her epic work, we'll see in a moment, called A Town Portrait, which is where the current installation really builds out from. But that also there was an opportunity to put it on view in context with more of her work, to tell a bit of the story of her legacy and life and work in Boston. And so I'm just so happy that that presentation can be on view. And in some ways, for me personally, is kind of this cosmic energy, right, of coming out of this big project at Brooklyn Museum, arriving at MFA, and realizing we had this great chance to show this incredible installation. So yeah, it was just to give a little context too before we dive into the work itself, that at the time basically that the Behold exhibition opened in fall 2023, Campos-Pons was awarded the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, right? So we had this incredible kind of confluence of institutional acknowledgement of this great artist's work, which of course builds on so many curators, artists, SMFA students, friends, supporters, and it was just a privilege to be able to witness all of that in that amazing moment. And as I learned in my years with Magda, Boston is such an important part of her story. I will be touching on that here in this presentation, but next week, when we dive more specifically into the rituals for remembering presentation itself, I'll be talking a little bit more about her history here, because as a curator of contemporary art, I was blowing people's minds by saying, this artist not only created artworks, but she created opportunities, right? If you knew maybe that she ran a gallery in Brookline called Gasp, the mission was to always show together established, emerging student artists, mid-career artists, right? So some of those things that I think Boston really benefited from reflect in the way that she makes her art and how collectivity is often at the heart of her artworks. But we'll get to the Boston story in a little bit more depth next week if you're able to join. And today is really a treat for me, since as the curator of her survey, I often was blessed to be invited to talk about the survey in its themes and its specificity of checklists, all that good stuff. But today gives me an opportunity to really tell a different and deeper dive, so thank you for that. This is sort of the landing page to look at a more recent work of Campos-Pons's called Finding Balance. So right away, you might be noticing like fragmentation, right? An image that comes up from multiple parts. You're probably noticing very specific uses of color, her theatrical robe that she's wearing, the crossing of the hair that spans the piece itself, the way that she's looking out at us, right? And I love also the very present tense title of Finding Balance, right? She might be reflecting on something, but she's doing it in the present. And so we'll talk in this long time that we have together today about how Magda moved from her very earliest work. I'm sorry, I always call her Magda, but I know it's a bad habit. Campos-Pons worked from her earliest works to something like this, which is as you can see, 28 piece work that spans more than 13 feet of width, right? So we're talking an artist who started in the studio, on a tabletop, like so many artists do, and gets to where she is now. And this in some ways gives us a taste of the way that her family and her upbringing comes through in her work. So we'll dive into her story of her Nigerian ancestors and her Chinese ancestors. But just to give a quick skim of this great artist's kind of on-ramp, She was a born artist. Campos-Pons often describes as a youth, listening and hearing music and going to the processions of the saints' days and of the Yoruba traditions that her family was sustaining and respecting in Matanzas, where she was born. Matanzas itself in Cuba is a really important city historically and today in terms of the development of music, global music certainly, but specifically rumba. And she has a very interesting narrative in terms of being born in 1959 there in Cuba. So she was born the very year of the Cuban Revolution and the year that Fidel Castro came into power, right? And so in some ways she talks about how she benefited from the early promises of the revolution, right? This idea that was part of the kind of structure of the political system, that artists were part of the revolution and that art served a purpose to tell the story of the people and to honor, the names or the legacies that hadn't been honored. But in her way, she observed those lessons, but to take them in her own direction. So at age 13, she went to the Escuela Provincial de Artes Plásticas. She was in the fine arts department there. And in 1976 through 79, as a young adult, she attended the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes, which is essentially the Beaux Arts School. So she describes that as a very traditional art education, but that because of Matanzas and Cuba's specific focus and interest in music traditions, that it was always very interdisciplinary in terms of dance, theater, poetry, and art sort of existing together in the coursework. But she never got the chance to really dive into photography at that time, which you'll see here and later is such an emphasis in her work. And so then as she grows from a young adult to a promising artist, she goes to the Instituto Superior, or the Higher Institute of Art, called ISA in Havana. She's there from 1980 to 1985, first studying, and then she becomes a professor in her own right, teaching the next generation. So what we're seeing here are some of her earliest documented pieces. These works are, to get a sense of their scale, you can see they're rather large, but they're also multi-part, right? So thinking about that photograph we just saw, these are sculptures that exist on a wall. As you can tell, the images were very old. We're not able to get these works to the US for photography, for the publication, for Behold, but these were images that Campos-Pons had retained. And when she was at the ISA, she was studying ceramics, art, and painting, and there was an emphasis again on this idea that the revolution, the new transformation of Cuban society required artists. So Campos-Pons talks about studying ceramics, in preparation for making shaped objects such as this, but they were also studying ceramics to learn how to make sinks and toilets and actually make functional, useful artworks just as much as they were learning about art. But she always kind of sought a more experimental energy, and she was looking and trying to figure out how could she learn more about photography specifically, which wasn't being taught at ISA at the time, and also performance art, which she was reading about and writing about and seeing in the streets of Cuba, but not really seeing reflected in the institutions. And so the work on the left was actually included in her 1985 thesis exhibition at ISA, and that show was called Acoplamientos, or kind of accompaniments, things coming together, which looked at themes of sexuality and prohibition. So you might be getting that sense from these images of a chastity belt on the left and the contraceptive on the right. So to break down the contraceptive, you're essentially seeing this abstract, colorful version of a uterus, and then you have that IUD snaked there in between. And so while Campos-Pons was invested and kind of a part of this Cuban institutional system, she was also thinking about ways to tell stories of protection and safety, and she felt like maybe contraception and stories about how the Cuban racial makeup of the population were constructed. So a lot of times in this era, you see her using black and white very specifically. And again, I realize these aren't the best images of this series, but to give you a sense of really where she was grounding in the early years of her career. And then from 85 to 87, she continued her teaching at ISA before in 1988 coming to Boston to come to the Mass College of Art. She was an invited artist who was specifically looking and studying at the Painting and Media Arts Initiative. So again, she was seeking out, right? She had the tools and the professors she was working with in Cuba, but she was able to connect with a different community. And she was really inspired with what she called interrelated interrelated media. So film, specifically in that time, Super 8 recorders, photo, and performance. So basically everything she couldn't do at ISA. And in that 1 year when she was here at Mass College of Art, that's where she discovered Polaroid, these large format Polaroid cameras that were being made accessible to certain artists, which will come up majorly in a moment. And so to take us from those grainy images to a much sharper view into this kind of shaped and painted narrative fragmented canvas. So to move from those images to a piece from 1990 called Soy una fuente, or I Am a Fountain. This is an interesting moment to reflect on. I know we're going to have some time for questions at the end of this lecture, so I welcome whatever your interest might be. Is it in the making? Is it in the political context? You know, I'm providing an overview today, but very happy to dig in when we have our chance to speak to one another. But it's interesting to track again, right, this kind of reality that Campos-Pons was born at this moment of revolutionary change, but because of many conditions, right, global and local in Cuba, in 1990 really is seen as the apex of what is called the special period, right, where Cuba had been supported by the Soviet Union, and of course with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the kind of financial support of the agricultural systems, economic pathways completely collapsed, very much exacerbated by the US embargo on Cuba, which continues today. And if you've seen the news lately, you know, this past week, the entire nation of Cuba is without light. So they're seeing extreme blackouts, and that continues to be kind of these local realities and sufferings that come from these larger global narratives. All things that Campos-Pons is very well aware of, because of course her family is still there, but also because, as you'll see in her work, she's thinking about these kind of differences or the lack of differences between the individual and the collective. And so this is a powerful year for Campos-Pons, and this is a powerful work that I think gets at some of the heart of her work of expressive, messy, and declarative work. So I Am a Fountain, that element of the work, as you can see at the bottom, is executed in ceramic, so clay tablets. So she was specifically thinking about monuments. How do you make things last? How do you make this declaration last? And if you've been absorbing the images, there are some obvious bodily fluids emerging, and then there are more abstracted ones as well. So we see, of course, the large eye crying its tear. We see the breast milk spouting out at the top, of course, giving it that fountain effect. We have menstrual blood and feces on the lower left. When we were installing this work, one of my colleagues was like, is that a tulip? So I think there's always that kind of question too of how we don't even want to see sometimes what the artists are showing us. But in this piece, this idea of I am a fountain, Campos-Pons is very early on embracing all of the messy outputs of one's body, and specifically a woman's body, because at the heart there, at the center, you have this fetal form, right? This possibility of renewal, this promise of the next generation. And that kind of odd S-curve form that comes from that central body is an image that she lifted from the Codex Mendoza, which is a Spanish colonial document made to kind of understand the rapacious takings from pre-Columbian or pre-conquest, pre-colonial communities. So she takes something that was meant by the kind of the colonial structures to designate something, and she turns it into something that is completely different, right? A promise. And at the bottom there, what looks like a heart is actually a mouth turned on its side, and it's spouting words that describe all of this. It actually says shit, blood, tears, and what Campos-Pons says about this piece is, you know, these are all the outputs of a woman, but the most important thing she does is speak, is her words, is her way of self-defining herself. So I love that this is one of the earlier works that we can really see in these beautiful images to kind of get a sense of that fragmentation that will come up time and time again in her photography. And you can see already early on, and you'll see this throughout, she's often very mischievous and bilingual with her titles. So sometimes titling in Spanish and then translating, sometimes titling in English and then translating, sometimes just leaving it one way or the other. And it's really about the emotion of the piece that inspires her titles. So if you have had the chance to see Rituals for Remembering, you might be familiar with this narrative film called Baño Sagrado, or Sacred Bath, The Rite of Initiation. And these are just some of the stills of that video, which is really ravishing and amazing to listen to, experience. There's a nice bench in front of it if you want to sit. It is 31 minutes long. But this is a project that she actually began when she was at Mass College in 1988. She was starting to think about film and how to document what would go on to be one of her kind of signature modes of making, which is growing up where she grew up in Matanzas, experiencing and seeing on the daily and in her family life reflected the Yoruba spiritual pantheon. Her grandmother was an initiated Santeria priestess, and so she kind of administered in spiritual and community-inflected ways for the whole community that they were in. And her father was an herbalist, so he was very well aware and knowledgeable of plant medicine, and a lot of the seeds that were growing and reflecting in her garden were seeds that had been brought, of course, by the West Africans who were kidnapped and forcibly migrated to Cuba to work initially in sugar fields and plantations. And so for Campos-Pons, she's always been extremely reverent, but also like an artist, appropriating and pulling forward these spiritual connotations and realities. And so when you see this video, you see different fragments, right? On the upper left is the sacred bath that begins the film. She's essentially cleansing her own feet with a traditional herbal cleanse, talking about, in a very disparate, abstracted way, how exhausted she is as a migrant, right? Like, what are the ways that the labor of moving, of being the only person in your family to leave where you're from and go someplace new, what does that feel like? She finished this work in Vancouver, where she had a one-year residency, and between Boston and Vancouver, she was reflecting on the literal change of temperature. So you also see a scene where she's in a bathtub, and she talks about always taking baths when she was in Boston because it was just so cold compared to where she's from. And so in the video, you see her use kind of this early stitching technique, obviously like immediately usable now on TikTok, but she's doing it analog, right? Using film to make tropical fish appear at her feet in this Boston bathtub. And then as the video progresses, you see images of her evoking some of the kind of fertility rituals specifically, but then also processional ways of being of the Yoruba or Santeria pantheon. You also see specific references. For instance, you see there at the center an image where water is pooling in her hand, and then within that pool of water, again stitched and projected, is Baracoa, which is where the Spanish ships first landed in Cuba. So she's making these analogies between the water within her, the stories of colonization across Cuba, and also has always been, and you'll see this throughout her work, extremely careful too and protective about what she shares about her spiritual belief and her backgrounds. There has been misinterpretations over the decades that she is doing the ritual in her art, but Campos-Pons has always been very clear in terms of saying she's pulling from these spiritual traditions, and that if you were acknowledgeable or you're part of this community as well, you can instantly see, the colors of Elegua and know some of the references she's making, but that she's never shared or done anything that is not like public knowledge, right? So there's the magic, if you will, of performance art, right? That makes us feel like we're present, that we're experiencing these changes in the video, these different narrative moments. But there's also, it's good to keep in mind, there's a carefulness to her approach and what she's doing and what she's selecting, which of course comes from her family background. And you'll see it throughout some of these slides, but very early on, when she was born, her grandmother designated, again, her grandmother being a Santeria priestess, designated Oshun and Yemaya, two of the Orishas, or deities of the Yoruba pantheon, as her spiritual protectors. So those two goddesses exemplify water and fertility and love and destiny and motherhood. So a lot of these themes are present in her life and her work. And I think what's also so powerful about this video is that it's not presented didactically, right? She's trying to capture that sense of immersion, sounds, music, percussion, and then color, right? Color becomes a huge symbol and powerful gesture within her work. And I will say too, one of the kind of powerful voices of contemporary art, you might be familiar with the great curator Okwe Enwezor, and he wrote a really beautiful essay about her work in 2007. And he was describing that her work draws from classicism, classic art, right? And some people might be reading that, myself included, and imagine that that is, what are we talking about here? And he makes it very clear that it's just a different classicism. It's the West African classicism. It's not the classicism of the Greco-Roman, which if you're inculcated in the Western art tradition, we might be able to recognize the columns, the, Caesar's head, what have you. So he kind of made this great essay in 2007, if you're interested in digging a little deeper, about that relationship of the classics, which will appear later. So as you'll see through this presentation too, there are some real gems of Campos-Pons' work in the New England area. Of course, coming from her 30 years living here. So in 1991 is when she established her residency in Boston. So if Paño Sagrado is the kind of interstitial piece, this is what it felt like to her to constantly go through the bureaucratic loopholes and procedures of immigration authorities, right? So she is inspired by the fact that she had to be constantly fingerprinted when she was passing through airports and borders and checkpoints as an invited artist on a residency, right? So she talks about how these systems of tracking and documentation influenced her life in positive ways, but also in a work like this, she's bringing it forward to us by essentially, in her words, she's like, the fingerprint is printmaking, right? We have, woodcuts on our own hands that we could share with about ourselves. So she's kind of exaggerating this bureaucratic fixation on tracking and documenting people through their bodies to create this more expressive use, specifically with bark paper. So that paper is a reference in many ways to the work of Ana Mendieta, who we'll talk about next week. But this piece, I know you can't exactly read it, but at the bottom there it says, "Even if my hands are clenched by mud, my fingerprints are my own. Let me be myself, let me search alone." And that's an excerpt from a poem by Mirta Aguirre Carreras, who, as you'll come to see and experience, especially once Magda kicks off into performance, poetry is a big influence on the artist as well. So there's lots of stories and narratives that I will continue to explain up here, but there's also that poetic impossibility of art to describe our reality, right? So there's feeling, there's intent, there's conceptual material choices, but Campos-Pons is always like, there's something else that art can only begin to touch. And so touch and the handprint comes up a lot in her work. And this was a period, again, 1991, where she is feeling in many ways isolated. She's connecting with her new community in this area, but she's also working for an understanding of visibility of Cuban artists in the US, visibility of Cuban people in the US, and just also dealing with the personal reality of leaving her family, right? And being the one who's not there. And so this piece, Umbilical Cord from 1991, this is a work in the collection of the great National Center of Afro-American Artists here in Boston. And this was incredible to bring forward for the survey because I think it shows the dimensionality of her experiences and how she was struggling and strategizing to bring them forward as artworks. So essentially what we're seeing in Umbilical Cord is this relationship. You're getting that sensation of these bellies, these women's bellies exposed. And these are her sisters and her cousins. So you see that they have names there carved in marble. So that idea of the monument and the permanent and what stories are told is coming to the fore. And at center, Amparo is her mother. You see also Africa, Maria, Abuela, and Abuela, the grandmother, the woman who was the priestess in the family. Her portrait sort of floats above all of these women who are united by this photographic project. And you might be wondering, how did she achieve this, right, if she wasn't in Cuba? She wasn't able to go back to Cuba for 10 years after leaving Boston. And so what she did was work with a Cuban photographer who she knew well, Ramon Pacheco, and he went and took these photographs of her family, of their arms extended in a certain way, and of their bellies painted with these crosses, which for Campos-Pons symbolize all the directions and possibilities of one's movement. And she, especially at this time, was thinking in her new city with these new tools about how photography could help bridge that distance. So this is just a detailed shot to show you that atop every image, kind of as these umbilical cords, as these bellies of lines, are these little wires embedded with Cuban soil that she brought over in suitcases. And you see here her own belly painted with the footprints, showing that she's the one who left, right? So you can get that sense that these crosses are balanced by the way that her cross is created from these paths outward. And in that same era, 1991 was a very fruitful year for Campos-Pons. She also created this very significant piece now in the Smithsonian American Art Museum collection called Tra. And this piece was created for the 1991 Havana Biennial. I'm not sure how much y'all know about biennials and the kind of global creation of art attention and whatnot, but in 1991, the Havana Biennial in Cuba was specifically positioning itself as kind of the anti-biennial. If these biennials were a place to go see cosmopolitanism and, parentheses, capitalism and all this possibility, that the Havana Biennial was sort of seeing itself as the decolonial perspective. And not for nothing, 1991 was on the precipice of very authentic celebrations of the 500 years of Christopher Columbus landing and sort of beginning this violent story of colonization. And so what's fascinating about this biennial, definitely, again, if you're into these themes, it's a really interesting year and exhibition to study. But Campos-Pons set herself out apart from them. So a lot of the work was decolonial, but what she felt was that the people who actually experienced the brunt of colonization and suffered the most and continued to face oppression were Black people in Cuba and Black Afro-Cubans. And so she kind of set out to say, my piece is specifically going to bring in the images and the portraits and the faces of the people who were not kind of part of this exhibition. And so this challenge to colonialism that the biennial was setting up, Campos-Pons answers very specifically, combining carved wood slave ship icons with, on the left, this series of 1, 2, 3 T-shaped assemblages of photography that she took when she was back in Cuba in 1990. Let me see, I know I have a detail here. Okay. So this is just a little zoomed in image here to give you a sense of the texture of, these are the people of Matanzas. These are her neighbors, her cousins, her friends, once again bringing in the carved marble. This is part of what she sets up. The reason it's called Tra is because she separates these kind of 3 themes of the transatlantic slave trade. So you already have the TRA in the transit. There's also the travesía, which is the route, the trata, the trade, and then the tragedia, or the tragedy. And so what she does is organize these portraits as generational conversations. So you have the elders, many of whom it was their grandfather who was brought over and forcibly kidnapped to come to Cuba. Then you have people of her age, right, sort of adults living their lives, and then you have the third, the youth, right, the kind of the promise of that next generation of Cuba. And so she really wanted to carry forward and specifically insert it into the biennial, this history of exclusion, of uprooting, but also resilience, right? The images that she brings forward are very everyday, almost celebratory. And she uses that word. She describes Tra as a cause for celebration because there was this opportunity to tell a deeper story that might not have been there before. And also I'll say too that Tra is a kind of an onomatopoeia, if you will, of the sound of the drum. So she's also linking, this violent, horrible history of colonialism and enslavement to the culture and everything that came in its wake, right? So this resiliency isn't only about surviving, but it's also about creating new modes of making. And this is something that she would continue to explore, of course, in the United States, where we have the legacy of enslavement continues to enrich our corporations, our institutions. And this is an early performance in 1992. You'll see later performances where this is very unique for her, Campos-Pons, in a solitary presentation. Again, she's very collectively minded as a professor and person. But this is a piece that she performed at the ICA, and you can see that adaptation, if you will, of the formal portraits of her friends and family in Matanzas to a photography that is laid on the floor around us. Again, she is also accompanied by the large carved slave ship icons. And each of these, you often see the number 7 recur, and those refer to the 7 Orisha powers, or the main powers of the Yoruba pantheon. And so many times that arrangement of the slave ship icon, of the way that people, African people, were forcibly organized, to maximize profit, maximize suffering, that's an image that she explores in a lot of her work. And I think in this particular installation is especially important and connects to the work in the MFA collection, because this is the first time that she publicly exhibited a photograph of her great-grandfather. His name was Gabriel, and he was kidnapped from West Africa. So her great-grandfather, not too long ago, right? She knew his name, they had his portrait. Some of the seeds that were planted in her father's garden came from him. In that Baño Sagrado film, you hear some of the kind of stories and Yoruba like everyday sayings that she grew up with and only as an adult realized came from her great-grandfather. So his image will come up throughout her practice, but this is really an early moment of her, putting her body, and I should say as well, this was during the exhibition opening. So she talks about interrupting the wine and cheese chit-chats, and that, it was meant to be a celebratory night for this important exhibition, and that she felt like absolutely not. We have to actually think about what's being explored here, were the actual lives that were affected. So she has painted on her neck numbers of people who were enslaved and killed in the transatlantic slave trade. So she's doing this, I feel like out of the frame. That's what I always think about with performance art, right? Often we see this like very beguiling, beautiful image of the complete performance, but what's out of the frame? Is it boredom? Is it frustration? Is it people at the museum saying this is going on too long? And I just feel like her fortitude, it just shows in this image and the way she's taking up that space. And as I mentioned too, Boston is where she began to explore Polaroid photography, and beginning in 1994 is really when she dives deep into this medium that is so reflective of her interests. So this singular image that we're seeing here is called "When I Am Not Here, Estoy Allá." So that's one of those kind of very intentional language selections. The title is both English and Spanish at the same time, and it essentially means when I am not here, estoy allá. So cuando no estoy aquí, I am here. So you can't really translate it one way or the other, right? You're having this bifurcated experiences of the two languages and the two experiences. And this work is very unique in Campos-Pons's oeuvre. It's the only singular Polaroid photograph that she created. And in this piece, you see the blues of Yamaya, who I had mentioned earlier is one of the protective Orishas who are a big part of Magda's life. And as you can see here, she's using her body as the material for this photograph, and in some ways is creating something very performative for us, right? Campos-Pons is invested in the Polaroid photograph because unlike other kinds of analog photography, which can be duplicated and made into an edition, or of course digital photography today, which can be even more so, Polaroid is like a performance. There's only one. There's no negative, there's no addition, and that you're basically capturing a moment. And she also absolutely loves the way that, as she describes it, the Polaroid is doing its own performance as well. So you see in the upper and lower quadrants, you can see the drip of the emulsion that creates the image. So she's like, I'm doing my own performance. The chemicals are doing my own performance. And this is something that she was able to achieve because the Polaroid Corporation was inviting certain artists to their studio to use their photography and their large format cameras. So this is not your handheld Polaroid. This is like a large Polaroid that creates a 24 by 20 inch image. And so you'll see that number repeated in all these captions because she was invested in this large format, almost painterly Polaroid type. And Polaroid at the time was also, well, you know what, I'll touch on that later. Let me focus on this image. And so I mentioned Yamaya, so she is the Orisha of the waters, and in many ways is seen as the protector who came over, of course, with the rest of the spiritual guardians from West Africa. And here she's holding in her hands a boat that she carved herself, and she has these 2 bottles around her neck that drip with her actual breast milk. So in addition to creating art and creating these images, she was also balancing motherhood, right? And starting a family and talking about riding the Amtrak, and going to the bathroom and pumping, and then people would give her a weird look because she had a giant tote bag of performative objects that were unusual for the Amtrak riders, and to know that she would go kind of in front of the camera and create this experience. I think in this work in particular, you can see how she's using, in some ways, I don't want to use the word simple, but like efficient gestures, right? We know they're waves, but the way that she's holding it, the lack of her face, the kind of posture and power, this is just one of many works where she's exploring these ideas of migration, and of course, of Black women as representing this kind of nourishment, right? In this horrible way, as the genesis of what was made possible through chattel slavery, but then also as these kind of containers of life and knowledge and pushing the family forward, right? With each new child comes a new possibility, and this kind of idea of cyclical forward movement is something that comes up a lot in Campos-Pons' work, renewal and revival. And so this is an incredible, significant work that's actually in the collection here of Dr. Alejandro de la Fuente at Harvard. So, you can see also the support of the community that she was in conversation with at this time as well. From that very same year, I think this is more typical of her photography, right? I mentioned that they're usually multiple parts, and here we get a really great sense of that. She's made more boats. We're also seeing the blue and white of Yamaya again. Her hair is painted with blue lines. Her dress that she's wearing is photographed in detail above, so you see that kind of blue gingham. And then below, those are actually just 7 blue ribbons pinned to a wall. And what she's done is create this evocation of where we are within the spiritual world. So the 7 ribbons are the water, the gingham is the sky, and she's kind of inhabiting herself in certain ways. Of course, this is self-portraiture, but again, thinking about where Yamaya comes in, where the spiritual protection comes in. And why she loved these combinations of Polaroids, not just to create, complex image across many objects, but she also described it as the topography of diaspora. So she talks about her own experience, but reflects on more collective experiences of the African diaspora in terms of, you are reading yourself through your family experience, through the omissions and the erasures of the archive or the institutions, through the stereotypes that are thrown and that you're rejecting, right? So she talks about these multiplicities are how one creates identity. So when you see these multiple photographs, she's essentially saying, nobody is one thing, and certainly Campos-Pons is not one thing. This next work, Identity Could Be a Tragedy, is following. These are all in the When I Am Not Here, Estoy Allá series, this piece in the Worcester Museum collection. And here we're seeing her use the exposure and light to make a comment on kind of racial categorization and who is safe and who is not based on their skin color. She's actually used everyday makeup, foundation, to create the sensation of paint on her body, and then removes Identity Could Be a Tragedy, and repeats this image for us. And I think what's so fascinating about this moment, when she's been using and collaborating with Polaroid, she's really reflecting as well on the histories of Polaroid as a company that supported South African apartheid, right? She was researching how Black employees of Polaroid led a boycott of those products so that there could be greater attention to what was going on. She's referring to the South, the reason that Polaroid is a big supporter of the apartheid is because they made a lot of money as the instant documentation for the passbooks, right, of Black South Africans. And so that was something that she was enveloping into this history. And there's this often confluence in her work about these shared struggles. So while she is very specifically, of course, Cuban, and Cuba comes up many times and many references in her work, she's interested in these interlocking narratives. So another example from this series, this is a triptych that, of course, I don't have the image of the frames here, but you could understand how they would hang together, where she's, again, using makeup on the right. Identity could be a tragedy. Those are her words. And then on the left, patria una trampa, coming from the Cuban revolutionary slogan, which was patria o muerte, so basically saying like homeland or death, right? We're fighting for our homeland. And what she's turned it into here is that the homeland is a trap or a trick. And this kind of idea that borders and nations and categorizations, they're dividing us from each other, and they're also not real. So while this is rooted in that Cuban revolutionary history, the way that she's again positioned herself in sort of different ways of showing her skin color comment on these realities. And on the left, you'll see repeatedly, and we saw on that first slide, the use of this white pigment on her face. And that is cascarilla, which is an eggshell pigment, which is used in many Yoruba cultures, but specifically in Magda's life in Cuba and Santeria, in rituals and processions as a way to kind of evoke and set space for a kind of a spiritual procession, an idea of purity or engagement or closeness with the deities. And so you see her use this white paint throughout her work. And again, while this is Campos-Pons, right, we're seeing her face, she's like, these aren't necessarily self-portraits of me, right? These are ideas, evocations, conceptual gestures. And at the center, you see her ringed with these rods, I'm forgetting the word. It's like a branch that you would use to pull aside foliage. And that's a reference to Elegua, another of the orishas, the one who opens the path, the one who allows you to progress. And I brought this rather rare instance of, almost a decade later, or I guess I'm not doing my math right there. A while later, Campos-Pons re-performing this work. So this was interesting as well, as somebody who gets to talk to her a lot and did a lot of research with her. She discussed also wanting to track her own changing body, right? And that the ways that some of these early performances show her in a certain way. And then when she had the opportunity later on, when the Polaroid camera became accessible again, the large format camera, that she wanted to kind of redo this work and sort of see how it would feel in her body after being able to go back to Cuba, right? So she's even returning to her own work in this way. Okay, I think I have to pick up the pace because we're like halfway through. How's everybody feeling? Good, good. Thank you for being a great audience. And the good news, of course, is that you can see some of these works on view nearby, which is wonderful. But this is another example of those rods I just mentioned that represent Elegua, the Orisha, who opens the path, who is meant to be the first kind of spirit or god that you invoke for any ceremony. And so this was something that, again, to tie into that idea of classicism, when we exhibited this exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, of course, we, like a museum does, we provided lots of texts and references and bibliographies and knowledge and whatnot, but there was just something very powerful in Brooklyn, of course, a very Caribbean community. Some of my colleagues and visitors, they would be able to just step into the room and be like, Yamaya, Elegua. So it's like the color choices that she's making, they are beautiful. They're about the experience of this as an artwork, but they're also so specifically tied to references to some of these orishas and kind of spiritual dimensions at work, again, beyond the photograph, right, beyond the artwork. So now I'm going to take us into some of her massive installations, because the Polaroids in some way capture these installations that are happening for the camera, compositional performances, but she also thinks big. Campos-Pons often describes the sensation of, she tells herself as a little girl from Matanzas, in the kind of cosmic universe. So she often switches between the maximal and the minimal, and the attention to a leaf, just as much as the constellations and these huge, horrible global histories. So the herbalist tools is one of the earliest she made in 1994. You can probably guess that this, of course, was in tribute to her father and the experiences that they had together walking through the woods, walking through the garden, and he was imparting to her, the knowledge as she was growing up of the fresh herbs. So this is, you can see here from the medium line, there are actual, plant life from cornmeal to the live plants and fresh herbs, but it's also combined with these stools, which you'll see appear later in her career as well, these references to the stool that her grandmother would always sit on that were very common, in the Matanzas area. And what you're effectively seeing here are the trunks of trees hollowed out. I know the image is one of the worst in the PowerPoint, but then you see that little aperture there. So a visitor was able to kind of get a little bit low and look inside the tree. And within the tree would be a repetition of some of these images you're seeing of the herbs and plants, and also the use of those bowls and the casserole pans, which are used in a lot of ritual. Again, that cleansing bath that we saw from the video. And so this is one of her interests, not just about telling her father's story, but she was also interested in how botanical history is also about crossing borders. And often some of the colonizing powers took much better care of the plants that they were transporting across the ocean than the people, of course. So she's interested, again, in how we value what we value, and wanting to honor, the way that plants also carry tradition from Cuba to the world. So who has had a chance perhaps to see the show nearby, Rituals for Remembering? Anyone yet? Good, amazing. Thank you, so great. It is gonna be on view till February 22nd, so we're just so pleased. This is the installation I mentioned being so excited about when I got here. This is the beginning of what I'll focus on, a trilogy of her work called A History of a People Who Were Not Heroes. So right there in that title of the trilogy, you're getting her definition of why and how and who she is telling this story about. And the piece in the MFA's collection is called A Town Portrait. That's why we're delving into this Campos-Pons portrait today. And so this is an image of the installation in full. And what I love about this installation is very flexible. So A Town Portrait is a piece where Campos-Pons is reflecting, again, from Boston about leaving Cuba, and specifically looking at this place called La Vega, where she and her family lived for many years, and she spent some of her childhood growing up in that area. And the memories of the women in her family is what she decided to undertake. She talks about coming to Boston and recognizing that a lot of the connectivity she felt to West African spiritualities, music, food, that was part of her upbringing in Cuba, that her colleagues as Black Americans in the Boston area felt like they had this rupture, right? The erasures and the white supremacy of the institutions and the US. And she was just struck by that, right? This idea that she felt a connection. And so she was, as an adult, looking back and thinking, okay, what were the kind of signs and symbols of this history of enslavement that didn't appear to me like that as a child? So the town portrait is made by asking the women in her family, so her aunts and cousins, about their memory of this town. So what was the first thing you saw? The first thing they saw is the tower, but what was something that the kids liked to play around? Well, you guys used to play Ring Around the Rosie around the fountain. The women used it as a place of gossip, but the kids would ring around the Rosie. That's that small ceramic circular object there. You'll see also on the right here that she's using video like the Baño Sagrado to kind of evoke these small rituals of cleansing and honoring. That portrait of Gabriel, her great-grandfather, appears on a rocking chair in one of the videos. And this piece is, like I said, flexible because it was intended that the tower and the fountain could be moved around. They're actually on wheels. Okay, they're very fixed in the MFA gallery, but once upon a time, the intention was that a visitor could use that, right, and to move it around and acknowledge that memory does change and that people have different recollections of where they're from and how they interacted with their surroundings. This is an image taken by the Peabody Essex they did a great 2015 project with Campos-Pons, where you can see kind of some of the architectures that she's evoking. This is from a different town, but also acknowledging the architectures remaining from the sugar plantation and the sugar industry, which is really what she's recollecting here, right? It's not just the town, it's this town that was a place where her ancestors were enslaved in service of this refinery that would be coming out from that tower. And so when you go to the galleries and you see this very fragile, small element on the left there, this is the glass door. And what it's meant to evoke is the inner size of a door that she passed through many times as a child. And if you get up close, you can read some of the passages of the history of La Vega, very kind of formal histories, again, intermixed with the words of the women in her life, and acknowledging that this place where they had a home and that she spent many years as a child was the same barracks that enslaved her ancestor, Gabriel. And this is something that she didn't understand until she's in Boston, making these calls, writing these letters, and seeing things anew as an adult. And so what I find fascinating about this history of a people who were not heroes. And not only is she telling these stories through the voices of the women in her family, she describes this as a counter history to the narratives that were being told in Cuba. She describes it as a monument, right? So she uses these very monumental and permanent forms. But she's also thinking about what are the kind of textures of monuments that can feel different, that don't feel like they're in this white male patriarchal language of people on horses and big names and, kind of a finalization, right? So a lot of touch and change is happening in her monuments. This is the second work in that trilogy. It is called Spoken Softly with Mama, again from History of a People Who Were Not Heroes. Whenever you see a work by Campos-Pons that carries a sound or performance element in this era, it's a collaboration with the composer and musician Neil Leonard. So when you go to the galleries and you can hear this, obviously you're just seeing the PowerPoint here, you can get that sensation of Campos-Pons collaborating with Leonard to create soundscapes, to evoke the feeling, in this case, of a domestic interior altar made into a super huge installation artwork. And so if that first piece was her kind of thinking writ large about this town and its architectures and the kind of spaces of enslavement, this is her taking it inside, and Campos-Pons reflecting on the way that the women in her family were all domestic laborers, and that she was the only one, the first one, to not be essentially relegated, forced by society to continue this work that comes from this legacy of enslavement and the domestic role of the Black woman in Cuba. But what Campos-Pons always talks about is the beauty and the power and intentionality that these women brought, not just as their work, for richer and whiter people, but to the work of creating safety and love and spirituality and community in their own homes. So one of the details I love about this piece, hold on, I'm just gonna switch back and forth here for this zoomed in image. These are tall ironing boards that she's wrapped with silk organza. So she's taking one of the tools of their trade and then literally like lovingly gilding it almost in this beautiful silk organza. And you can see in this image really well the embroidery she's created that is layered on top of these historical images of the women in her family. In this case, these were all women who were no longer living. And so she was bringing forward for us the finery, the precision, the intentionality, the love of their portraits. And you can see that at the bottom there, she created a whole field, almost a flotilla, right? It feels like ships amassing at the shore of glass irons. So again, another tool of their trade that's transformed, that's evoking, the passage, but also changed and updated and enlivened. In this image where you see those colorful images, those are all projected videos of Campos-Pons performing in very oblique ways, dropping pomegranates, dropping pearls, spinning and dancing, holding folded sheets of white on her head, these kind of gestures of honoring them. And in this piece in particular, if the first in the trilogy was thinking about the words and the memory, this was her wanting to create what she described as an altar to these women, saying, I wanted to honor them in a contemporary art way, but I wanted it to feel like a home altar. So that idea of like the glowing portraits, their names are embroidered at the bottom. So you see, Faustina, Nica, Amparo, their visages are there, and they're lit almost like if there were candles in front of them. So it has this, this just amazing tactility and presence to it too. And silk and remembering and memory comes up in the third iteration of the History of a People Who Are Not Heroes. Meanwhile, the girls were playing. This was actually commissioned by the MIT List Art Center. Anyone see it here, perhaps, in Boston? Yes, I love that, amazing. This piece is, I feel like the first two in the trilogy feel monumental, but this is dispersed in a way. There's 3 large circles, again, of silk organza, and this idea, the meanwhile the girls were playing, returns to that idea of, as an adult, looking back on your childhood and thinking, what was going on? I was spinning toys, I was getting dressed up for church. What was happening in the adult world? And so the colors of these 3 spread dresses refer to a memory that Campos-Pons has of her and her 2 sisters wearing the colors that they would always wear, in dresses made by her mother, of course, who you see the kind of legacy of that embroidery come through into Campos-Pons' work as well. But she's thinking about the kind of darkness and the realities of, the childhood pleasures of candy, for example. She talks about eating spun sugar and playing these games and recognizing that, of course, sugar is the emblem and the output of this horrible, violent legacy, right? So meanwhile, the girls were playing, she's playing as a child, but this whole history of, human abuse and exploitation is happening, in the world and continues to happen, which is another major emblem of her work. So, this was a very rare moment when all three of these were installed at the Frist Museum, but we're really lucky to have here the town portrait. And next week, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about that work. And, I'm looking at the time, and I always talk too much about Campos-Pons because there's so much to say. But next week, we also will look at this nesting series. But I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because I want to talk about some of her more recent work as well. And so in the nesting series in around 2000, her kid is growing up. She's here building a life with her family in Boston, and she's reflecting on homemaking. So nesting comes from that idea of, on the one hand, kind of the freedom and love that comes from a union and a family, but then also kind of the entrapment and shelter that comes from a freedom, comes from a family. So there's always these dualities in her work. And in this series, she's actually using antique bird objects. I think these are meant to sort of scare off other birds that were gifts from her mother-in-law at the time. And so you see the birds come up in the references, and in the work that's in the MFA's collection, Nesting 4, all that's left of the bird is this kind of blue feather. If anyone is a bird specialist, please talk to me after, because Campos-Pons told me that this is a New England bird, and I don't know, and I really want to know what bird it is. But you can see, too, that she's starting to use her hair as a way to, or hair twists and hair knots, as a way to create sculptural presence around her portrait, around the use of her body as a tool in this photographic practice. But then here specifically almost illustrates that idea of nesting and entrapment and entanglement that happens in a family. And so this is another image here. This is built out of 4 individual Polaroid images. So again, just to take us to that studio, think about the intentionality of how much math, honestly, goes into creating an image that you hope will line up, right? So she had to stand in the same position, use similar shutter speeds, plan the way that that blue watercolor expanse is hovering in front of her face. This is all happening in reality and then photographed for the camera. So some of these compositions can get very surreal and get very textural, but they're all being evoked in this kind of performative photography. And then when it comes time for her happy reunion with her mother, 10 years after leaving Cuba, she was able to go back and then bring her mother to Cuba to meet her son, to meet her family in her new life in Boston. And she uses Polaroid and uses photography to tell the story of their reunion. So the H shape here, you might be counting the 7, so that is a reference to the 7 Orisha powers, but the H is also home, hogar. It's who creates your home, right? It's being together and unified. They are united here by these Yoruba beads, and as I mentioned, Yemaya and Oshun as the twin protectors, they're wearing the colors of these Orishas together. And this piece, I think like umbilical cord, is showing photography used as a bridge for connection, right? A way to document moments of unity, but to show that hard work of love and how a labor of love and connection is something that is to be sustained, and that's something that Campos-Pons always emphasizes in her work. But these kind of loops and continuities continue to grow as she challenged herself in the Polaroid field. So here you can see a 16 Polaroid grid. This work is in the collection of Indianapolis as well as Harvard. So Harvard has a great example of Elevata. Like I said, there's no duplicates, but it's almost like an alternate. So it's very much in this style. But here we see her planning compositionally abstract, ambitious Polaroid interrelationships, right? You see the hair spanning in this kind of cosmic way, reaching, it feels oceanic, it feels celestial. This kind of idea that she is a witness, she has her back to us. She's looking at things that we're trying to understand ourselves, and maybe in these artworks, she's also making that work of understanding. This piece, Classic Creole, I love. It's kind of a offbeat work that's in the ICA Boston collection. There's also a 15-panel version that gets much wider, but this is where we see that idea of classicism come back to us. She's thinking about these columns and edifices of knowledge and the Yoruba pantheon being a huge part of that, but I love the playfulness of scale here. So what we're seeing on the left and right are very detailed shots of beads. And then at the center is a faraway shot of her own body wrapped in this Senegalese fabric with a kind of bouquet of flowers on her head, and she's turning herself into the bouquet, right? So this is performative, it's her body, but she's kind of using it to create volume and space rather than some of the feelings that, like something more like this work, The Calling, right, where we can see that performative gesture across both, right? Again, this brings that question too of, that intentionality of this is two photographs taken in two different moments brought together. So what was that like to prepare and to choose the costume, to put these cascarilla marks on her body, how to create a performance in a still image. And this is another work too where I think it's important to acknowledge, while she's honoring, in this case, Obatala, another one of the Orishas. He's kind of the creator of humanity, the creator of man. He was an artist, he was a sculptor, he is a sculptor. So she's talking artist to artist, with her spiritual guides and gods in this work. But for her, Campos-Pons describes her calling being to the arts, right? So she said her grandmother always said she would not be a priestess, she had another calling. And so you see that kind of reverence, respect, but also difference come through in the way that she's making her work. This is one that I never get to share about, but it's another kind of a different approach, right? This kind of mystery of motherhood and connection and lineage, the magician's tools. What are we sitting here? Some of you probably know, right? These are children's science experiments. It's her son Arcadio's, take-home lessons on science in the Boston area, and Campos-Pons takes it into the photography studio, right, and creates this kind of like mysterious evocation of motherhood. It's sort of deflected in the way that she's covering her own body there, but I love the kind of ingenuity of this piece. From here, Magda took a beat, okay? Often we don't talk about that in an artist's career, the exhaustion and the work, and the time that one needs to rest. And so I'm going to skim through some of these works here. El Nacimiento de la Flor de Cardi. These were all made when she was living for 1 year in Padua, Italy, and she went with nothing. She's like, I didn't bring my studio materials, I didn't bring any notebooks, I needed to rest. I ate prosciutto, I walked around, I went to the Scrivini Chapel, and she began a series in Italy called Sono Qui, or I Am Here, where she's tracking not only her own presence in Italy as a Black contemporary artist, with her family there, walking around the city, but also the historical presence of Africans in this idea of the Italian Renaissance, right? Where did all that gold and luster come from? So in this image, we have another sort of image of motherhood and birth, almost like a top-down image. I included this iPhone detail of mine, so I know the colors look very different, but here you can see that she's using embroideries from cloistered nuns and mixing them in with another evocation of that early motif of the IUD, the contraceptive, mixed in there with the uteruses. And then, of course, the way this milk thistle is bursting out from her legs, there's birth, there's creation. So she's kind of uniting this image of reproductive power, thinking, of course, as Black women as, this global cipher for this kind of idea of regeneration and possibility in history, but then also emphasizing specifically the milk thistle, which is a plant that as it grows up, when it falls, where it falls is where its seeds are planted. So by virtue of growing and dying, the plant is always pushing itself forward and bringing its own lineage forward. And that's something that inspired Campos-Pons. This is a work that the MFA Boston just acquired, also from this series. Because of this acquisition, we've actually become the museum with the strongest representation of her work, which we're very proud of, followed by the Perez Museum and the Smithsonian. But this is another work from that series, specifically using gold and rubies and the Yoruba crown to designate and hide the image of this woman she met, Rita, who was a contemporary woman from Nigeria, which is where, present day Magda's ancestors would be from. And so she was connecting with Nigerians, meeting them in Italy, they were often relegated to kind of selling bootlegs, right? And this kind of marginalized labor force that nonetheless begs that question of, where were these rubies and golds coming from in the Italian Renaissance? So she was also doing research to understand the history of Black artists and Black artisans and merchants in Venice. So she was evoking that by carving her own Renaissance-style frames, by working with a framer who has been framing things since the 14th century. And so always thinking about history. Another piece from this series, La Viajera, she's gilding her own feet. These are carved into wood, honoring her pilgrimage, her walking, and the video that accompanies it is her walking and pounding all these different contemporary sidewalks, historic tile work, and sort of saying again, sono qui, I am here, I am here. It's a great series that only up until recently had never been seen about outside of Europe. So I think this is something that we're in an encyclopedic museum, right? And the impulse of the encyclopedic museum can be so much about categorization and separation and difference. And I just love the way that she's not only honoring her own path, but leading us to new stories, right? And leading us to better understandings. Okay, well, we have 15 minutes left. How's everybody feeling? Good. You're so great. There's so much more to see, so I'm going to skip over some of these Polaroids so that we have about 10 minutes of conversation with each other. I'm always happy to return to them as needed. But you can see and follow the kind of development and unfolding of these sculptures and images and eyes. We see her begin to really delve into watercolor, always a passion of her work. The one that carried the fire, this is a self-portrait of the artist we see there on the small scale. And her mind, her thinking, her interiority becomes this conflagration of both destruction with the fire, but creation. And so this is another work that you can experience this as a watercolor self-portrait, and you can also see how it relates to the history of Shango, who is the Orisha of fire and war, and his colors are red and orange. And so you see these red and black, you see these kind of colors and choices come up time and time again throughout her work. A couple of the other major installs that have happened, Sugar Bittersweet. This is in the Harvard University's collection at the Cooper Gallery of African and African American Art. This is a motif around the spears, the traditions, using the different colors of sugar to tell a story of refinement and how this refinement to white sugar doesn't change the taste, but had real material, violent ramifications on the people, who are harvesting it. She continues to carry these narratives forward in performance, right? So to be honest, in 2012, we start seeing more images and documentation of her performance because we're hitting a more digital age where things are better archived. So she goes back to Cuba in this work, Llegó Fefa. She's honoring the Cuban street sellers, thinking about her experiences with street sellers in Italy, and then reflecting on her home and what's happening there. When you go to the gallery here, you see this beautiful 9-channel piece, 9 Polaroid piece that's on loan from Tufts University. This was the year that Tufts gave Campos-Pons her solo exhibition here in Boston. And so this was part of that exhibition. And it also showed her starting to visually weigh, and she would explore this in much more depth at the Venice Biennale that year when she represented Cuba, understanding her Chinese ancestry, because 5 generations before her, on her mother's side, she had a Chinese ancestor who she began to understand and research further. Chinese people were part of this sugar industry in Cuba. They were brought in as indentured laborers, and that system of indenture and debt kept them trapped in different ways, but in the same place, the same site, the same economy, the same factory as Campos-Pons's enslaved ancestors. And so I think there's a misconception in some ways that Chinese indentured servants might have replaced African enslaved labor, but Campos-Pons, not just her life and her reality, but her work, she's telling us that story of this was actually concurrent, right? This is happening at the same time. These are narratives that are woven together, and that you can't understand, such a complex and horrible reality as colonialism with some of these kind of boundaries that we put on each other. So in this case, she's wearing a kind of Cantonese theatrical robe, and I love this image too because She wasn't supposed to do a performance at the Venice Biennale. She applied for it and they told her no. And so she did it anyway. And if you know Venice, this is like the Piazza San Marco where everybody is. So of course when she applied, they're like, no, you can't do a performance there. That's a tourist place. And she brought this whole procession of musicians and performers with her. That's Neil Leonard there on the saxophone right behind her. And so you can see that fortitude of her performance. Well, it's 2:20. And I got us to 2013. So I have other images of her more recent work, some of the installation she's been working on as of late. I have images of more of her performances, but I also want to pause to see if folks have questions or reflections. I know that since we're on virtual as well, we want to make sure that if you have a question, you say it into the microphone. And so Paige over here, my amazing colleague, has the mic if folks have questions or reflections. Here, yes. A mic is coming your way.
Just 1 second.
They're going to bring you the mic so that people online in cyberspace can hear. Thank you.
I was just curious if you could talk about how she had so much access to that large Polaroid land camera. Was it at Mass Art or did she own one? Or?
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I actually left that dangling, so I appreciate you coming back to me because what was happening was she was interested in Polaroid had offices in Boston, so they had a rich collection of works, but they were specifically reaching out to artists like Campos-Pons and Dawood Bey because the chemicals and technology they developed for photography was racist. So it was based on white people's skin and was not doing a good job in kind of capturing other skin tones. And so while they were doing this kind of open invitational for artists to experiment and make work, they were also kind of doing their own research about how to update their technology to make it more reflective of people. And so if you get a chance, we did create a book for the survey called Behold, and my colleague Maisie Harris, who's the curator of photography at the Getty, where the show traveled, she did a great essay specifically that delves into some of that history of like why Polaroid, why that moment. But this is a moment of great access, and as we were kind of following along this chronological unfurling, you could see that she took a break from the Polaroid, right? So she went to other mediums. That was for practical reasons. She couldn't access it anymore. They weren't allowing artists at the same level. And so this moment of 2013, 2015, when she goes big and finding balance, this is her being able to access the Polaroid again. And it's something that comes and goes, right? So, in my research and like in just following the news around Polaroid, there's moments where they're like, we're back, we want to do this, we want to experiment. And so Magda and other artists are able to get in there, but I think she's also an artist who's very crafty in terms of how she makes work. And so for her, she was very inspired by Polaroid, and once she saw that starting to lift away, she's like, okay, I'm gonna go back into my installation tendencies. And then like many artists, an opportunity will take her someplace. So I also had some images here of, I don't know if folks saw the amazing commission at the Peabody Essex Museum. So this is a magnificent piece of multiple giant glass sculptures. And so she was thinking, okay, well, if I'm not gonna be able to work in Polaroid like I was, what are other mediums that mean something to me? So returning to the town portrait and that use of glass, saying, I'm going to create these fantastical glass sculptures that are about where all this violence and all this pain, where did it disperse to? Where did it go? And how do we honor that? So this idea of the alchemy of the soul came through. But that's a great question. Thank you for bringing me back to it. Another question or thought? Yes. Let's see, the microphone's coming.
I was just wondering why she left Boston and moved to Tennessee.
You guys are helping me out here with my narrative continuity. Thank you for a great question. I'm going to skip ahead. I'm sorry we didn't get to these. Maybe next week. So in 2018, she was offered the important role to be the chair, Cornelius Vanderbilt Endowed Chair of the Arts at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. So that was something that really drew her interest. She's there now building not just their art department, but she's building a lot of bridges in terms of Vanderbilt University, acknowledging their history of enslavement, acknowledging kind of the intersections of art and justice, something that was kind of part of the gallery she ran here in Brookline, which you can see a little bit of in the ephemera case in the show. But she was very intrigued by Nashville as a new site. And she had been here in Boston for almost 30 years. Next week, we'll talk about some of her students who are now formidable artists in their own right, who are also on view in the galleries. But this image here, Secrets of the Magnolia Tree from 2021, this is what Campos-Pons describes as the first work she made like in Nashville for Nashville, right? Like she continued her practice 2018 to 2021, but it took her a few years to really sift and understand and sit with the history of what Tennessee meant, right? This very specific place in the US. And she talks about if in New England some of these racial histories were kind of subaltern and, silently spoken about, that in Tennessee, it's all there for you to see and it's all been witnessed, but it's never discussed, right? So in the Secrets of the Magnolia Tree, she's talking about what have the magnolia trees of Tennessee seen. She's like, they are beings, they have their own power to witness what humanity is doing to each other, to nature, to the earth. And so this is a work where she is going huge. I think this is one of her largest watercolors to date. You can see some of those bridges where she's combining large-scale photography. Now she's going digital, so these are inkjet prints that she's then watercoloring and glittering and combining on top of. And she creates this portrait of herself as this all-seeing owl, so returning to that idea of nesting, but rather than kind of say reflecting inward on a family, saying now's the time to witness and look out for each other, and aligning with this idea of what do the magnolia trees see. And if you ever get a chance to go to Nashville, which is really fun, she's also created a gallery there. So she's doing her work again to bring forward emerging artists, emergent ideas in her new city. But like I said, she'll be here November 13th. If you want to hear from her, we have a couple more minutes. Any other questions, reflections? Yes. Coming your way.
Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. I was just wondering about her reception in Cuba and wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, that's such a good question, and I'm realizing I don't think I have an image of the biennial itself, but Campos-Pons has often inhabited a specific. Is the right one? Okay, yeah. A specific position vis-a-vis leaving Cuba, and you might know, or you will be able to research artists who have been very vocal in terms of signing on boycott lists or saying we shan't work with the Cuban government, which is something that she admires, but Campos-Pons has always had this idea of we must connect with each other. She describes I wouldn't be able to get out and have my work seen if it wasn't for people coming from outside of Cuba to see that biennial, right? So she's like, that for me was really important. And so I think Campos-Pons is somebody who is globally renowned, right? The Genius Award, she just opened a big new installation, the Sao Paulo Biennial, and so much Cuban culture and ideas is in her work, and so I think there is a respect for her there. She's often involved in mutual aid efforts. A few years ago, if you recall that horrible oil rig explosion, that was actually in Matanzas, where she's from. And so she just immediately, with the same pathways that she was getting artworks on view in Cuba, she was able to kind of bring medicine, bring, support systems that way. So she has somewhat of a fluid relationship there. And then this piece, Matanzas Sound Map from 2017, another collaboration with Neil Leonard. This is on view at the Tate Modern now for just a little bit longer. And in this piece, she was doing recording in Matanzas because she started a biennial there, actually. So she was invited by the Havana Biennial to basically be the special curator for 2018, I think. Maybe it was 2016, somewhere in there. Apologies, I don't quite remember. But she took that invitation and she said, yes, I will, but I'm going to do a biennial in Matanzas. So if Havana's on one side of the island where traditionally the intellectual creative community is, she was like, no, this is actually, we need to go to the Afro-Cuban city of Matanzas, and that's where we're going to have the biennial. And she brought a lot of really great artists from her time, here in Boston, and some of her new colleagues in Nashville, and they were doing performances and showing work. She had Julie Mayretu send prints down there, and so she's somebody who is trying to kind of continue to build those bridges. And I fear that's taken us to 2:30. So I thank you so much for being a great audience and listening. I know so much to see. And I don't know if folks are going to be participating next week as well with a deeper dive into the works on view in our show with a nod to Ana Mendieta. But if not, I just will go through and let you look at some more beautiful works by Campos-Pons. Always seek her out if you have a chance. Again, she's going to be here November 13th. It was really a great joy to work with her and to continue to be able to work with her. And let's see, I did bring some images here. You can see her returning to glass. This is a collaboration with the Venetian glassmakers of Murano Island. A performance she made during COVID, right? So she didn't take COVID as a time to sit at home. She created performances that could be connected digitally. In this case, When We Gather, that then went to the National Gallery of Art in a cleansing of that space. This is from our Brooklyn Museum presentation. Oh yeah, and I just added this. So like I said, she just opened in Sao Paulo at the Biennial up until early January, a major installation where she's actually enlarging for the first time digital reproductions of her watercolors into this kind of spiral entry. These are all taken from Instagram, so sorry for the bad images, but I couldn't find formal ones yet. But here you see this hot pink object is actually made of glass. So I was seeing other images where you can really see into that object, but it's also paired with some of these larger figures, kind of protective guardians that are, they seem like people, they seem like flowers, they seem like plants. So this kind of unity of the plant world and ourselves. So yeah, thank you again all for being here. See some of you next week. Take care. Thanks to my colleagues for organizing, coordinating. Appreciate y'all.